Delighted to have you here at our second Centre for Progressive Policy annual conference to discuss all things inclusive growth. I believe we're the 9th session of the day, so hopefully we'll come in with some snappy comments to make sure you're all still with us, and as we talk about, as Nikki said, going glocal. So what does this mean? We're here this afternoon to speak about the pushback against globalisation and how international, national and local players are responding to this pushback and what they can do to abate people's concerns. This morning we heard from Jeffrey Banks from the IMF, who set out how globalisation has helped millions of people be alleviated from poverty, but increasingly even the international institutions who we know are normally champions of globalisation and a free market approach are recognising the sort of wider implications on inequality or environmental concerns that are having to be taken into account more and more so. So I will be handing over to our esteemed panellists, each from a different tier of institution, to speak about how we can respond to these increasingly pertinent concerns. So before I hand over, I'll just do a quick introduction to each of the speakers. We're going to start by hearing from Caroline Freund. Caroline Freund is the Director of Trade, Investment and Competitiveness at the World Bank. She's previously been Chief Economist in the Middle East and North Africa with the World Bank, as well as working at the IMF, the Federal Reserve and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Caroline will be presenting to us today on the World Bank's 2020 World Development Report on Trading for Development, and no doubt we'll pick up on what the recommendations of the World Bank are on how we reconcile, as I say, these increasingly pertinent concerns on globalisation and the World Bank's current view. We'll then hand over to Marvin Rees. Marvin is the Mayor of Bristol and has been since 2016. I would put him in very much the international category of mayor. He's very joined up to a wide array of international networks of mayors, including with the OECD. And we at CPP have been working with his office on his One City plan for Bristol, where he's been bringing together stakeholders from across the sectors to drive forward a vision of inclusive growth for Bristol. Then, without further ado, I will be handing over to David Halpern. Now, David Halpern has had many impressive hats and holds many impressive hats. He's currently Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team since 2010. He's the founding director of the Institute for Government and was a former chief analyst at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. And I believe number 10 still bend his ear on a one-day-a-week basis as it stands. He's a published author and has held tenure at Cambridge, Oxford and Harvard. So I think we have the right people on stage, that's for sure. So without further ado, I will hand over to Caroline.
Thank you very much. I think I'm the global part of the Go Glocal. What I'm going to talk about today is our flagship report that just came out at the World Bank, and it's really on, there's supposed to be a PowerPoint. Is it going to come up? Oh, there it is. Okay. So the main question in this report is whether there's still a development path through trade, given both technological changes as well as increasing uncertainty and rising protectionism, and also what can we do to make trade more inclusive? And I think that's a topic that's especially pertinent for this conference. So one thing is, when we think about global value chains, we often think, and this is really trade that crosses more than one border. So you produce a part and component, it goes somewhere, gets transformed into another type of semi-finished good, maybe goes somewhere else for final processing, and finally gets to the consumer in another country. So it's crossing several borders as it goes. And what we find is that all countries participate. We usually think about those hubs in factory Europe, factory Asia, and factory North America. But countries do different things. Some produce commodities at the front end of a value chain. Those are the countries in red. Others produce light manufactures, apparel, light electronics, things like that. And then some get more into innovative manufacturing and services. So you can see the three hubs very clearly here. Our framework for thinking about trade and what really changed in the recent history is around these global value chains and what's different about them. And that is that you don't have to produce a whole industry. I was just learning in Bristol, they produce the wings of airplanes. They don't produce a whole airplane. You can just specialize in one part of the value chain. There's a city in China that produces nearly all the buttons in the world. So by specializing, this kind of hyper specialization, it's much easier to trade. So that's one reason countries have benefited. Another is firm-to-firm relationships with the lead firms and large multinationals that drive this kind of integration. Comes technology, know-how that helps countries develop faster. They learn things from participating in these value chains. We look at what drives them as well as the outcomes, the growth and poverty reduction that comes, but there's some issues around inclusion and the environment. And then we think about the policies that can help countries to enter and benefit, as well as the policies that can help ensure the growth is inclusive. So what happened with global value chains? There was this period between 1990 and the mid-2000s when trade grew really dramatically, twice as fast as income was growing, and these global value chains really developed. So trade was starting to cross many borders. Part of that was because of remarkable changes in policy. China opened its economy. The European Union let 12 countries in as the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe opened up. We had the development of the WTO and the Uruguay round and the North American Free Trade Agreement. So huge changes in trade policies made it much easier to remember every time you're crossing a border, you're getting taxed. So with these lower trade taxes, goods could cross borders more frequently, trade, global value chains rose, but then the financial crisis hit. There were no more big new trade agreements, and we see both a slowdown of trade and a decline of this new type of global value chain trade. So why should we care about this? Why is this important from an inclusive growth perspective? It's important because it boosted incomes and created better jobs and reduced poverty. It has had a mixed impact on inequality and the environment that we need to think about. But we do believe that it can continue to support growth as long as the many developing countries that still aren't fully open, like in India or Brazil, open up further and participate in trade, and the developed countries, the advanced countries, continue to pursue open, predictable policies. So one point I want to make is just about joining value chains and what happens in developing countries. There are huge income gains to joining and moving into manufacturing. Gains come again when you move into advanced manufacturing or services. So big gains from joining these. But there are some differences across regions, and I know that has been a topic of this conference. So this shows how in Vietnam, as they've moved into global value chains, you see that it was happened in very specific regions. The good news is that poverty fell dramatically where regions were involved in value chains, and it had effects around the country. It's contributing to poverty reduction everywhere, although you do see more intense disparities. Everyone grew, but some regions grew much, much more than others, and this is something to think about. Technologies are changing. How is that going to affect the ability to trade going forward? Some are worried that automation and 3D printing might actually bring lots of production home. We actually find quite the opposite, that industries that automate more, and the automotive sector is the most automated industry, uses robots very intensively, actually thrive on global value chains. They still, productivity increases, but then you still need output increases, but then you still need the inputs that can't be produced with the robots. And so trade and global value chains have actually thrived most intensely in industries that are more automated. Similarly for 3D printing, there's one good that's almost all 3D printed now, hearing aids. And as that technology took off around 2007, actually trade in hearing aids increased more than other similar goods. So it's not the case that technology is really likely to slow down this. What is more of a concern is policy. So let me just quickly, I just have a minute, go through some of the costs. A really big concern around trade and value chains is the decline in labor share of income we've seen in advanced countries as well as developing countries. And part of this is due to value chains. They're more capital intensive in advanced countries, and while they have less capital intensive production in developing countries, it's still more intensive than the other sectors. So more rents are going to capital as opposed to labor in this new world that we live in. Female workers gain, but global value chains haven't helped us break the glass ceiling. They tend to involve lots of production workers, but on the other hand, female managed companies and owned companies aren't participating, and that's something to worry about. I mean, I'm going to skip that and just go to the environment because I think that's more interesting for this audience. One real concern around global value chains is all this round tripping and the effect it could have on the environment. And there are some concerns, and there's more packaging and all these electronic goods and so forth. We could see industry moving to places where there are fewer restrictions around pollution and so forth. That fortunately doesn't happen, but there is a concern around the waste and shipping costs. On the other hand, we have a lot of new environmental goods like solar panels and LED light bulbs and electric bikes because of global value chains. And we see the lead firms being concerned about their reputation, pushing higher standards in their companies. So we focus then on the policies developing countries can take to get into global value chains, as well as international cooperation. And I'll stop on this point about international cooperation, because I think we're in a stage now in the world where this is really critical. It's breaking down, and there are some issues that aren't being handled in the institutions that we have that will need to in the WTO in particular, that are sort of gumming up the trade process and will need to be addressed cooperatively, whether it's issues around state-owned enterprises and subsidies, whether it's how to tax capital in a world where it can move and profits can be shifted, especially through global value chains, and how to address the new economy where we worry about things like privacy and competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that's given us a lot to pick up on in the discussion, but I like how you've handed over the mantle very smoothly there to Marvin when we're talking about international cooperation and whether cities are the answer to that.
Okay. So the first thing that struck me is you left off there talking about the importance of global cooperation versus a challenge we have at the moment of there being an appetite for political messages that talk about division. And the importance, therefore, of when we talk about the model of our economic development and the way we do trade, the importance of social factors within that as well, such as people's sense of identity and belonging, and how the way we do economic development does or does not support some of those wider challenges. So I am here talking about city leadership and the potential role of city leadership. So if I just whip through a few thoughts. First of all, is that I think that at the moment what we're witnessing on the planet is somewhat evidence that national governments working alone are no longer equipped to cope with the world challenges the way they are. On issues from climate change to democratic legitimacy to inclusive economic development, even to housing delivery, national government leaders sitting around a table trying to work out what levers can I pull in national capitals to get results across their whole countries and around the planet is just not working. And I think that what we need is global, national and international governments to move into its next iteration. And I use that term on purpose because I'm not talking about the end of national governments. We're just talking about the next stage of the way we run the planet. And that has to involve the leaders of cities and networks of cities as equal partners in shaping national and international policy. Number of thoughts around that, and this is well worn. Bruce Katz has written about this, who's obviously here today. He's in Michael Bloomberg's book as well, Climate of Hope, and Ben Barber, When Mayors Rule the World. The immediacy of city leadership to the results of the policies that they end up implementing. We see whether things do or do not work straight away. It's not through Guardian articles or Ken Loach films. It is right in front of us when we walk to work. And the need, as Bloomberg points out a lot, to be pragmatic and to work with people who want to get things done. This is a challenge at the local level when we try and take national political divides and impose them onto city politics. It doesn't always work with that like that. We'll work with anyone who wants to focus on real delivery and stop playing ping pong and city games. I think in many ways the world has got post-national as well. The reality of it, whether we're talking about global value chains as an example, and cities are post-national levels of governance. We are not a local delivery arm of national government. We are democratically elected governance areas with international populations. Bristol has 180 countries of origin and 92 languages. We share a population in Bristol with Somaliland and Somalia and Minneapolis, and we share populations with Kingston and Jamaica. So there is an interest within the city as to what goes on globally, and what happens globally impacts on families in Bristol. And beginning to take advantage of that and to recognise that is an important part of the city's growth. Local radio, when I used to work at BBC, it was all about what happened within geographical space. I kept pointing out that hurricanes in the Caribbean matter to people in Bristol and actually can impact on them financially if they're sending support home as well. But also for the sake of our economy, when we pulled together our local enterprise partnership in the west of England, initially, to be perfectly frank, and don't want to offend anyone here, it was all middle-aged white men. And yet many of the economic opportunities could be in West Africa, East Africa, across Asia, and we had populations with family, economic and political connections to those parts of the world. So to talk to the business community about the opportunity that exists within our population to find connection and opportunity in those parts of the world, was one that we've moved on together. If I talk about, and last, just to finish off on this question of economic inclusion, I think cities on the front end of a failure to deliver inclusion. Abstract conversations or opportunistic conversations around migration at a national level that bear no resemblance to the international nature of our populations, our ability to hold communities together across differences of ethnicity, racial origin, class status as well, are impacted by that. But we have to do it on a day-to-day basis. We have to deal with the need to drive the economy, but also to provide economic hope for people. And I think that releasing cities into global governance will certainly push that that way of thinking, actually release a new source of energy into everything, one that's not ideas bouncing around within national boundaries only, but ideas that are developed because they've worked across national and international boundaries as well. You know, migration conversations that were informed by my view, Yvonne Sawyer's view, and Mayor Garcetti's view, Los Angeles, Freetown, and Bristol. That's a different way of thinking about movement of people, finance, capital, whatever, than you'd get just by nations, you know, on a zero sum journey. So happy to mention Brexit. I didn't mention it there, but there are implications for Bristol, and we'll talk more in the conversation. Thanks.
And now David, with his experience across national, local and international, is going to respond to our two previous speakers.
Great, I'll respond. I don't know if it's kind of supposed to be, it's global, you know, local, and now I'm the human because we do the behavioural.
You said you're all three, David,
but I will definitely weave back, if I might. So, I mean, what my day job is, of course, a behavioural economist, right? And the idea of why don't we build our models on a realistic model of human behaviour? And the slightly dirty secret, which we all sort of know, so it's not a secret, is that a lot of our economic models have been based on a set of assumptions which we know are wrong, like the classic economics textbook, or indeed seminar. Let's assume the following things. We know they're totally implausible. Let's just go along with it for a while, and then let's suppose what happens next. And the idea is, well, imagine you did that in a world where you actually started with a realistic model of a human behaviour. Would it get you into a different place? Of course, the classic defence is often, when you look at kind of global or even supranational economic policy as well, in the average, it'll be a bit like we're rational. Well, a bit. So what we've been trying to do since 2010 is say, well, let's try and flip it around. The other bit of this story, I think, is one of the ironies about behavioural economics has been least applied to economics. Even though there are now 4 Nobel Prizes awarded to it, you say, well, how has it really changed economic policy, right? It's not obvious. Most people would struggle to identify it. But, you know what, let me just quickly then flip through. And what does it mean to micro, macro, and then spend just for most of my remaining time on the local, the regional, I might. So what does it mean? Well, we know people aren't very good at essentially optimizing in certain ways. Even Harvard graduates, when you give them kind of interesting financial choices, they're not very good at working out what's the best option, right? We're just not very good at it as human beings for the most part. And it has lots of manifestations. It has, of course, interventions that it lays bare as well. So on pensions is the most famous one around, well, we kind of assume there's something wrong with Anglo-Saxons and we don't want to save for the future. No, we just can't be bothered to fill out a bit of paperwork where we have to tell our firm, you know, could you let me join the, you know, the scheme? Our best estimate for a tax subsidy, how much extra saving it produces on pensions, for example. For every extra £1, 1p of extra saving, 1p. We're spending 20 to 30 billion a year in the UK alone, right? Is that good spend? Doesn't seem like it. What else can you do? A lot of micro behaviours around inclusive economy, around why is it that low-income individuals often end up with terrible deals, such as around hire to buy, some of the things we see on a high street, which are an interesting puzzle. And one of the reasons it's thought to happen is because, particularly what's called tunneling effects, if you're under financial pressure, you appear to make worse decisions. And it's true for farmers who make better decisions after harvest than they do before, and the same is true of low-income individuals that are around us. So there are lots of micro examples of it, and it has quite important implications. It's also actually true at macro level, before we flip in between. So we did some work, for example, with the Bank of England, inflation reports. I don't know how many people have read an inflation report. Maybe in this room some of you have. Oh, wow, very good. What an elite audience you are. Anyway, an interesting idea about inflation reports, the Bank of England, is that to tell people about what they think is actually going to happen with the economy, and it might actually affect your behaviour, right? You might do something differently, except we then ran comprehension tests to see whether people can actually understand inflation reports, and most people don't understand very well. So literally, can you rewrite them in ways that actually people understand them in relatable forms and increase comprehension? Turns out you can do quite dramatically, and it increases, by the way, trust in the Bank of England along the way as well. So you can use it in this level. You can use it around R&D tax credits and so on, about will firms adopt them, will they not? Of course, issues with welfare, for example. Can we get people back to work faster in terms of inclusive? Yup. For example, we run trials now in the last 4 countries where you find, if instead of doing what we've done for 40 years, which is to say, because we don't really trust you, which 3 jobs did you apply for last week? Right? We changed it into saying, well, forget all that and say, what are you going to do next week? It gets people back to work faster. And it's quite a stumping effect, actually. So you can use these things. You see the micro and the macro. And I'll give you one last example around labour market and inclusive growth. Is getting more women and others who've got kind of more demands on their lives into the labour market. And one of the key issues is, why don't more employers advertise jobs? It's a very simple thing, right, in some ways, as flexible. If you talk to HR managers, they say, most of our jobs could be done flexibly. So you say, well, why don't you advertise them as flexibly? Oh, yeah, I suppose we could. So we run a trial, big trial, a couple of 100,000 firms and adverts, where we prompt firms and say, do you think this job could be done on a big platform, basically, flexibly? And they say, oh, yeah, well, why don't you think about just adding it? So we do that, and we get about a 20% increase in the number of those adverts that just say at the end, could be done flexibly. What does that do for actual individual behaviour? Well, that in turn increases the number of applicants for those, as a randomised controlled trial, by 30%, right? So it's actually quite a simple intervention, but actually potentially big impacts. But let me turn now just finally to why do I think so much energy and interest is around actually not the national level, but it is local. And I'll just quickly flip through what, to me, we're in election period, so I'm a bit careful about some of my wording, but imagine you did the world using what we now know about behavioural economics. And we're running Bristol, and what could be done? And we're very upbeat because we think it is actually possible to boost growth, and in fact specifically inclusive growth. Well, if markets don't function very well, how could you improve their functioning? So examples would be, actually around the labour market would be a good example. So when you're choosing your next job, you can probably find out what you'll earn, and you maybe talk to a few people, but can you find out some of the key things that would really matter? For example, is the boss basically David Brent? Right? It's really bad, not only for your actually financial well-being, actually your life satisfaction is greatly affected by the quality of your manager. Or are there progression opportunities? Well, imagine if you so-called de-shroud it, you reveal that information, right, which you can talk about how you do that in practical terms, but it changes the labour market because it changes the competitive pressure away from just the pay rate into, is this a good job? Right? And it's perfectly possible, certainly possible at a local level to say, hey, that's the kind of problem we could crack. We could reveal that kind of information. B2B market, in our view, is riven with behaviourally based market failures. You're a small firm. Is it worth hiring McKinsey? Should you swap your accountant? Who can help you with your website? How do you answer those questions? The market doesn't generally solve it very well. So in our backyard, HMRC, the revenue service, they have amazing data actually about the number of firms who make applications and basically the tax advisors who have lots of errors in their work. Across Britain, there must be firms going, oh my God, it's terrible to deal with the revenue. Actually, they just need to change their tax advisor to one who's more competent. Is that available to you? I'm afraid it's not. Why not? Can you see how it improves market functioning by de-shrouding this kind of thing so that good firms in a deep sense are able to take market share? So that's definitely possible. You can do it around other kinds of beyond conventional markets. Care home, trying to choose a care home for your mum. Right, you can find out the price. Can you find out the quality in a local area, let alone anywhere else? Generally not. Is that what you want care homes to compete on, just on the basis of price? Clearly not. Or which supermarket you walk into. Your best choice around this is not when you go in the supermarket trying to live healthily, all those individual micro choices. No, your best bet is to choose a supermarket which in general prompts you for healthy and green options. What's the special offers? What's by the checkout? Where's the website that tells you within where you live the best supermarket in Bristol is, for green, et cetera, is what? So you again shift the competitive pressure. It's really doable. You could do it on innovation in terms of new channels for innovation. We can talk about that. But the last one, let me at least mention, is the kind of the most important variable often not talked about, which is social capital, it's sometimes called. Which is, do you trust other people? Does information spread, et cetera? So it's true at both national and local levels. So this is an old question. Generally speaking, do you think other people can be trusted? Hey, we could try this with you today, actually. Generally speaking, do you think other people can be trusted? Who would say yes to that question? And who would say the alternative I didn't tell you before is no, can't be too careful? So you are really weird, by the way, which is worth knowing, but its own right. So in the UK population, there's about 30 to 40% who would have said yes to that. Europe, practically 100%, some didn't know. Is it consequential? It's incredibly consequential, right? So it's a better predictor of national economic growth rate, whether you think other people can be trusted and so on, than, for example, levels of human capital and skill. It also explains, by the way, a huge amount that happens in regional differences. Because if you live in a world where you think other people can be trusted, hopefully because they can actually be trusted, information flows better. It means you can do deals without having to have a lawyer in the room every time. I can just shake hands because actually I know you, right? And who do you employ for the job? Do you have to use your cousin or do you have to use the best person for the job? So it's possible to intervene on those variables, and it's much easier, more effective to do it actually at a city or a regional level than it is at a national level. So in sum, I actually feel like if the bad news is, oh my God, we've been using these ridiculous models for economic growth, the good news is that if we actually introduce these more realistic accounts, it opens the door to a whole range of policy levers which we haven't used before, which we have every ground to think, in fact, can boost growth and, in fact, specifically inclusive growth. Thanks.
Super, thank you. I really think that between the three of you really did cover all levels, so I'm very pleased about that. In fact, David, if I could just pick up on this notion of trust, and I wonder whether in each of your different roles you have a view on trust. And Caroline, in global trade, is trust an issue that has fueled kind of popular discontent with global trade? You know, Marvin, in Bristol, do you think this kind of direct accountability and transparency that you talk of in Bristol grows a greater trust and can be achieved at different levels of government? I'm kind of interested in trust in your various organisations. Maybe Caroline, would you like to?
Yeah, I think there certainly is. I don't know if it's exactly trust, but I think the discontent with trade stems from how economies are doing. So what we see is that in countries, and particularly the low-income countries that have been benefiting from trade a lot, when you ask them, do you think trade is an opportunity or a threat, and questions like that, like the vast majority say opportunity. They say it raises wages and so forth. But when you ask people in communities or countries that have been stagnating, they're much more concerned. And so there's really a difference between what's happening in advanced countries, in particular communities in advanced countries, versus what's happening in low-income countries where there was no industry that's changing. So industry's really pulling people out of agriculture. Whereas in some of the advanced countries, and most of it's about technology, it's about changing demand for products, and then to some extent it's also about trade. But I think where trust comes into it is trade is much more tangible. So if you're in a community where industry is leaving, it's much easier to blame the foreigner, to blame outsourcing, to blame trade, than to think about the policy failures that may have happened in terms of giving workers other opportunities and support, mobility as a way of moving to cities that are thriving versus those that are being left behind. So I guess where trust comes in some sense, is that trade and globalization get caught up in the broader kind of xenophobia that happens in some communities.
Yeah. And Marvin?
Well, trust faces, I mean, when you raise that, it faces in loads of different directions. First of all, I'll share, we work to make this a value within the behaviours within my cabinet, but actually rather than talking about trust, we talked about trustworthiness. I think it's naive just to go around trusting people. Secondly, you can't talk about, again, we can't abstract economic development, and I'm very aware that there'll be different experiences in different countries and different kinds of development, but you can't abstract our desire to have trust today with a history of exploitation and inequality. If we do a deal and I get £1 and it makes me feel good and I found out you got 100, you know, there's going to be an issue with that, and that's our history, right? Our history is one of exploitation, colonialism, destabilizing political leadership, racism, gender pay differences. There is no basis for unqualified trust, and we can't abstract the desire to have a trust-based economy with a world that's acted in an untrustworthy and an exploitative way. I mean, look at now, unprecedented levels of inequality going on. I think trust also fits into a couple of things, I'd say. One is perhaps you might say there is an opportunity at the local level to behave for a politics that's closer to the ability to be trusted. It's still very big, but you know, I stand on the edge of a football pitch with watching our kids play football. You know, I walk to work, or I run to work, or sometimes ride a bike. I do things with ordinary people, and maybe there's something about investing in that that immediacy of the city level leadership. It's still 500,000 people in Bristol, but you know that brings it closer, and people know where I grew up. You know, there's if I'm going to say, I think there's also about the poor quality of our civic discourse right now as well, and there's a whole bunch of involvement in that undermines trust. A few years ago, I ended up at breakfast with Stanley McChrystal, and he said that the price people pay for getting involved in public life now is so high that good people just ain't going to do it. Now, we've got this turkey shoot culture at the moment, whereby if you go on Question Time, to get a clap, all you need to do is ask a question or make a statement in a very angry way. Doesn't matter if what you say makes sense or isn't true. You ask it angry, and you imply that all politicians are a bunch of rubbish, and everyone will clap you. And that's what our civic discourse has become, all right? And that feeds over into our ability and our inability to think about the way we do national governance and international relations. The classic is what happened on Friday, last week, with the 5% guy. I'm not in the top 5%. All Fiona Bruce had to say was, yes, you are, but she didn't. She facilitated the row. And the journalist culture is one that is driven by a clickbait revenue source. That means that confusion, mistrust, and conflict are the source of that business model, and I think that feeds over. And I think it spreads in all directions with our social lack of cohesion, but also the impact it has on our ability to build a relationship for trade. But I might be wrong in all that. It's just me shooting from the hip.
I doubt it. And in terms of then relating that to institutions, I'm sort of interested in the evolving relationship. I know some international institutions have, perhaps also the World Bank, with cities, and cities being a kind of new stage of international dialogue. And I know, Marvin, that you're very much involved with that, a very connected city in Bristol and a connected mayor. Institutionally, do you think that makes sense as the next evolution? Why cities for you are that useful place to have those international conversations?
Well, we used to be. Cities were obviously a lot more prominent historically. When I came in, I didn't come in 16 I was elected. I didn't come in saying, right, we're going to get involved in all these international networks. But it quickly becomes clear that you have to, right? And the interests of your city are dependent on city leaders being involved on the national stage. Migration is a classic example. I mean, we don't want to be on the receiving end of national and international failures around migration. We want to shape it. So last year, I spoke at the Global Compact on Migration at the UN. And I'm not over-claiming on my part, but I was the first mayor to speak into these negotiations that have been going on for 3 years. Yet most migrants leave cities, go to cities, and return to cities. How are you having a conversation on that global policy on migration without talking to city leaders? That's absolutely ridiculous. Same with the Global Compact on refugees. So we're finding that we do have to assert ourselves. Now, that's not being done by invitation. It's being done by cities beginning to self-organise. And actually, where national governments are not responding, that's actually where we talk to the international organisations that say, if you want to be more effective, you can't just get jammed up in the bureaucracy and the turgidness of national governments. You need to work at a more dynamic level of governance, and that's at the city level and networks of city level as well.
Yeah. And Caroline, I know the World Bank have also been kind of broadening the scope of inclusion, that things that you've been monitoring in order to assess inclusion. For instance, the income share of the bottom 40% has become a kind of standard feature now of World Bank assessments. Is that something that's been in response to this sort of agenda, or from local leaders? Where has that come from?
Well, I think the World Bank has always been about poverty reduction. But with the rise of incomes, especially at the top of the distribution, we brought in that concept to this idea of shared prosperity and the income share of the bottom 40%, as well as the share of income or the share of the population in extreme poverty. And I would say also that research has shown that supports this city view. Research has shown that as countries develop, as they grow, it actually happens through urbanization and through what happens in the cities. And so the World Bank as well is starting to work more at the subnational level and helping reforms programs get implemented at the subnational level, so not just in one city in the country that may not even, the capital city often is not even the industrial city. So, so I think this view of cities is actually a very important one, and one that's increasingly gaining traction in the whole development and growth areas.
Yeah. And David, from your kind of view from the centre of government, do you see an increasing willingness or appetite of central government to facilitate these conversations at a different level?
I mean, we believe ourselves to engage in cities. I mean, we've been working, BIT is it's co-owned by British government, but it's a social purpose company. We've been working, for example, in the US with Bloomberg, at Bloomberg's request, 60 cities we've done interventions. Interesting. Why have we done more interventions in US cities than we have in UK? But that you want to try and make it live and figure out, what's effective practice. My view, I'm trying to be a little bit provocative maybe, is that there's been a kind of tacit account between a classical economic view of the world and often many of our big institutions, which is the best thing government can do, is sort of get out of the way, right? And our view is that's not true. You can make markets function much, much more effectively. And it also needs to be an empirical thing. So I also serve as a day a week as national advisor on What Works. We have a local economic growth What Works centre. But the real shocking thing in that area is when you dig into it, how poor the evidence base is about what is the most effective practice, institutionally or otherwise. The last point I just quickly make to kind of loop it back around, which is around this social trusting. When I ask, do you think other people can be trusted? Is a lot of what we sometimes attribute back to government or institutional performance, in fact, is a reflection of the character of the social capital in society. That's what the original Italian study was, where you introduce reforms. The cities with more social capital and regions grow faster because they are able to utilize it. If you've got good citizens who are happy to pay their taxes and they'll recycle because they trust each other and so on and so on, it's much easier to govern. And in fact, World Bank were one of the leaders, Knack and Kiefer, 96, So it's like to weave that story together is something which government, nationally is quite a long way from, whereas cities actually, they need to kind of rediscover, as you were talking about, a kind of self-belief about how it is possible, but then you have to twin that with a really robust empiricism, not just what we think might be a nice idea, but what actually does work.
And do you think, Marvin, sorry, in response to that, you have what you need to be able to help build that? Or I'm kind of egging you on to do a call for devolution, and I haven't quite got there yet. But
the call for devolution is, again, words are limited, isn't it? It depends what we mean by it. I've said, actually, I think the first thing we do actually need is certainty. So working with national government is like playing bingo, right? We package up a collection of development opportunities, we present it to government, and someone desktop analyzes it and comes back and says, no. Or, your numbers may come up, they may not come up. And if my numbers come up, it's at the expense of Manchester. If Manchester's numbers come up, it's at the expense of Birmingham. There's no way to run a country, right? So I've said to the National Infrastructure Commission when they came to visit Bristol a couple of years ago, give us 10 years of certainty, we'll give you a 10-year development plan. But work on our development plan with us and make your partnership with us bankable. That doesn't mean you write the check today. It means there are no surprises. So when we turn up in 3 years with a plan for an underground, as we want to build in Bristol, we're not, we may get it, we may not, with a population and that does not, with a population that immediately says, oh, big infrastructure delivery, you're pie in the sky, it's all nonsense, which is, then we don't get the democratic support for the scale of development we need to deliver housing, deliver transport solutions in the face of climate emergency. It helps that political leadership by having that certainty. Can I just say something just on the resilience as well, just because this is one of the things we've talked about. That's okay to go into resilience as well.
Yeah, with final remarks, sort of comment.
On resilience, I would just like to make sure that when we talk about resilience, we're not using it in a passive way. We're talking about it in a proactive way. This is not resilience in the face of a harmful world, right? Ultimately resilience is built by building capacity and strength. And in that sense, the conversation not just about equipping national local city leaders to cope with the consequences of policy happening around us, right? One is how do we shape policy so that we get stronger? And that's a challenge for government because they won't want to see decision-making power leaching out of Whitehall and Westminster or possibly Washington into other places. But I think that we've got to think of it as an asset-based approach, not a passive recipient approach.
Okay. Any final remarks? Any hopes for what comes next, or any notes of optimism to leave us on? Yeah, now we've got one from Marvin.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, interesting thing for those who follow Whitehall carefully, we've got these they're the great pillars you might have heard of, which Mark Sebwell, the CABSEC, has been pushing, but maybe less well known. There's something called the National Leadership Centre, recently created, which instead is intended to flip it around the other way, which is to say, why don't we just work with some local leaders in relation to, well, how do they think they'd do some prosperity stuff? And then let's actually support them to do it and figure out what kind of ideas they come up with. And then can we nurture and support it? I mean, if we're going to do that, the question is that a seed we can grow around about what are all the other institutional changes? What would be the shape of an innovation fund that would look good? I mean, even with my what work centres, which I think are great in lots of ways, but the danger is they replicate, if you're not careful, the kind of pathologies of Whitehall, as opposed to if you're building it from your end, what would it look like? So I think the NLC, National Leadership Centre, is definitely something to look at as to whether it can generate some really powerful examples of what can be done at city level, which will actually basically teach Whitehall what the game really should be.
Okay. And maybe just to add at the global level, that right now there's tremendous uncertainty in the global environment, but and trade is slow and we're not really sure of the direction, and that's holding investment back and holding growth back. But I would say that the late 1980s actually looked very similar to this period, and US was involved in a trade spat with Japan at that time, and everybody thought trade was slowing forever. And that was just before this period that I showed of tremendous growth, both economic growth and integration. So I guess my hope is that these challenges in the global economy get resolved in a positive way. There's more uncertainty, and we can go back to more predictability, more policy predictability, and more growth.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think on that optimistic note, we will leave the session there. Without further ado, a great round of applause for our super speakers. Thank you.